Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. We've got some more HG P407 this week. We're going to install the gearbox and get the radio box ready. Let's crack on then. Step 6, the drive shafts. Not too surprisingly, we're going to need the 2 drive shafts along with the gearbox. We're also going to need 2 screw pins, 2 E-clips, an M3x8 grub screw and a ball nut, which I spent quite a while looking for. I actually got to the point where I was starting to think they were missing from the kit. Next I had a good look through the build manual, and there we have the parts being fitted to the shift rod on the gearbox. Then I remembered the nuts and bits that were fitted to the dampers, and yes, there we go. The balls and the bits are already fitted to the shift shaft. And it's the same with the drive shafts, the screw pins were already fitted in the ends. It really would have been nice if the assembly manual actually matched with the assemblies you get in the box. I suppose it's only really a minor thing, but it's still quite annoying. To fit the drive shafts then, we need to remove one of the screw pins. Slide the yoke over the shaft on the gearbox, long one on the rear and a short one on the front. Reinstall the screw pins and tighten them up. When done, we have a gearbox that's ready to install in the chassis. Step 7, fitting the gearbox. The front of the gearbox has a couple of lugs that use a couple of M3x6s to attach to one of the cross members. The rear, however, uses a couple of rubber grommets. The instructions want us to just stuff them in and go from there. However, just like with the dampers, they have a small tube inside, so if we just stuff them in, we're most likely going to damage things. What we'll do then is remove the 2 long screws that hold the grommets to the gearbox. These screws also help secure the end cover to the gearbox, so they're done up quite tight. With them out, we end up with a short aluminium spacer, the grommet, and a flange tube that goes inside. Now in a perfect world, all we'd need to do is pop the grommets into the holes in the middle cross member, sit the gearbox in place, and pop the screws and spacers back in. In reality though, those spacers are just a bit too big. If we did manage to get them in, the grommets will be absolutely crushed against the cross member, mitigating any benefit from having the soft mount. After much fiddling around, I replaced the stock spacer with 2 of your basic stamped out M3 washers. It gives us a roughly 1mm spacer, which puts the cross member somewhere near the centre of the grommet. You can really see the difference in the thickness with the stock part held up alongside. There's just no way that would ever work without causing damage. Anyway, with those in the right position, we can install the 2 front screws, the M3x6s. They go through the lugs on the gearbox into 2 threaded holes in the cross member. Nip them up and the gearbox is in. On the underside, we still need to install the drive shafts onto the axles. First, remove the screw pins, then slide the yoke over the shafts and reinstall the screw pin. The drive shafts do feel pretty good, but like most metal ones, they are a bit rattly. But I think they will do the trick. We might end up with some nicer ones at some point. It depends how noisy they are when running the truck. That's most of the chassis done now. So next we've got the radio box to build in step 8. We're going to need 2 standard size servos, one for the gear shift, which doesn't need to be anything special. I'm going to go with the one that we initially got for the 3 Racing X Reel, but we replaced that with a mini servo, so this one's going spare. For the steering servo, we need something with a bit more torque. Now I've got a waterproof 20kg servo in the post, but it's not here yet and I really want to get on with the build. So for now we'll just use an old servo until the proper one turns up. One of the old Traxxas servos will do. It's got Futaba splines which will match up with a new one, so it should be a very easy swap later. To hold the servo in, we're going to need 8 3x8 self-tappers and 8 M3 washers. For plastic, we need the 2 mounting bars for the servos, H3 and H4. They're easy to tell apart, as one has round holes in the end, H3, and the other one has slots, H4. And of course we're going to end up needing L1, the big box. Now since we're going to be taking the steering servo out again, I'm going to tap the holes to M3 and use M3x8 cap heads instead of the self-tappers. With any luck, it will make life easier when we do the swap. I'm going to tap the rest of the holes in the box too, so we can easily adjust things later if we need to. The shift servo currently has the 3 Racing X Reel servo arm on, so we need to remove that first. We're going to be fitting Servo Savers later. The shift servo fits in the middle of the bars, and the manual wants us to use 2 screws, one in each corner. But since we're not using the kit screws, we'll use 4 screws, adding a couple of extra washers to spread the load. For now, we just want the screws to be not quite nipped up so the bars can still move around a bit. The steering servo fits in the same way, but in the holes that are nearest us. The gap at the top would have had a 3rd servo for the mechanical speed control, but since we're using an ESC, that spot's going to be left empty. The servos can drop into the main box now. You just need to make sure the servo wires are well out of the way and aren't going to get pinched. Then we just fit the 4 screws with the washers to keep them in. As usual, we'll fit them all loosely, then go around and nip them all up when they're in position. When it's all together, the servos feel very nice and solidly mounted. It's still not the greatest place for a steering servo though, but it's going to get us going. Step 9. Building the Servo Savers. For this we need the contents of the Servo Saver bag. We've got the 2 arms, 2 plastic springs and the boss parts. In addition to those, we'll also need the 2 metal springs that give the plastic ones a bit of extra stiffness. And for screws there's 2 M3x8s and 2 ball nuts. Lastly, there's the 2 linkages, the short one for the gear shift and the long one for the steering. We start with one of the bosses, the bits with the splines on one side. We want the splines downwards so we can clip one of the plastic springs over the top. Then, over the top of the plastic spring, we need to fit one of the metal ones. Now they are a fairly tight fit, but they are doable by hand. Both the Servo Savers have the same base, so we need to make 2 of them. Interestingly, a little plastic washer dropped out the second one. Now there's no signs of it in the diagrams, and there was only one. A bit strange, but I can only imagine it wasn't supposed to be in the bag at all. The arm with the 2 inline holes is the gear shift arm. We want to fit the screw and ball nut in the end hole with the ball on the top. It can be done up fairly tight, and a little bit of thread lock probably wouldn't hurt too. The arm then just presses into the top of the boss so it engages with the spring. Quite a simple setup, and it does feel a bit better than most of the kit Servo Savers. It should be plenty good enough for the gear shift. The finishing touch for this one is to clip the short linkage onto the ball end with some pliers. The other Servo Saver is assembled in the same way, this time using the middle hole for the screw and ball nut. There was this extra part left over though. It's not shown in this diagram, but the arms are actually in 2 pieces. The arm itself has a top cap. It looks like the gear shift arm became separated with its cap at some point, leaving it loose in the bag. All we need to do is press it back in place. And it's not something we can leave out either. It's there, so when we do up the screw that attaches the Servo Saver to the servo, it leaves just enough clearance that the Servo Saver can move without binding. The last little job is to clip steering linkage onto the steering Servo Saver. Now it's not 100% clear which way around it's supposed to go, long end to the servo or short end to the servo, but with any luck it won't be too tricky to swap it round if we need to. Step 10 now, fitting the Servo Savers and the lid, which is actually the floor. For screws we need 2 3x8 self-tappers and 4 M3x8 machine screws. But I'm going to be replacing those with cap heads just so they match up with the rest of the screws we've used on the box. To make it easier to remove when we swap the servo, I'm going to tap some threads into the 4 holes that the lid mounts to. Before we fit the Servo Savers, we need to centre up the servos. You can connect up your radio gear, making sure the trims are nicely centred, or if you have a servo tester, you can just plug it in and centre them up without all the messing about. While the servo's powered and centred, you can pop the Servo Saver on as close to 90 degrees as you can. It's rare to be perfect, but usually there will be one orientation that's a bit closer than the others. Because both of these servos have plastic gears, we're just going to use the self-tappers provided in the kit. But if the servos were metal geared, we need to be a bit more careful. Most use M3 screws, but some use M2.5. The length though, 8mm, should still be correct. With both of the servos in and set up, we can pop the lid on. It's a lovely fit, just as good as any proper Tamiya I've come across. To stop it falling off, we'll use the 4 cap heads in place of the stock Phillips screws. Step 11, the lid for the electronics. Just a quick one before we go. The cover that goes over the bit where the receiver and ESC live. To continue the theme, we're going to use an M3x6 cap head rather than a Phillips. Now we could fit the ESC while we're here, but without the receiver and servos there's not really much point, so I'll save that for an electronics focus video. For now we'll just fit the lid. I've already tapped the hole to M3, so all we do is pop the lid in and nip up the screw. I think I'd rather there was some sort of quick release clip for those times you need to fiddle with something while out in the woods, but at least it's only a single screw. So that's going to be it for this week then. Next time with the P407 we'll be fitting the electronics box and getting the chassis on its wheels. We won't be able to test it though until the rest of the electronics turns up. Anyway, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you got something to say. Bye guys!